I'd like to tell you a story. It's a story about places, it's a story about people, and it's a story about the times in which those people and places existed. The logical place is to start is with one of the building's namesakes, Robert Hinton Heterick. He was born in 1833 in Georgetown, Ohio, down by the Ohio River. And he came from a rather interesting background, but I would say fairly humble. His father was a cigar maker. And whether that had anything to do with his subsequent choice of the armed forces as a career remains to be seen. The other half of the equation, however, was a family with very strong local ties. And these would be the Felker family, or as it was known in German, Volker. Michael Volker came over to the United States in 1872 and first lived in Upper Sandusky for several years, where he met his wife, Caroline. Now, it turns out that he was far more successful in matrimony than he was in agriculture. He did try farming, but with very mixed results. So he ended up moving to Ada, tried agriculture again, and this time he got it right. He chose to have a lifetime career with the Pennsylvania Railroad, held quite a number of different positions. The one that I think is most interesting was the very last one he had, which was as the crossing guard at the Main Street intersection. And he had an office, if you would, up in that little tower. And that was where he would manually raise and lower the crossing gates. And for careless pedestrians, there was a whacking big bell there. I don't believe that is actually him, however. But in addition to trying to help control the local mortality rate, he was instrumental in the community in creating Our Lady of Lourdes Church, and also in helping Ohio Northern with its enrollment situation. So as you can see, 3 of his 4 daughters attended here. The first of these was Sophia, and she was actually a long-term resident of Ada after graduation. She attended this rather formidable-looking Gothic pile, the Ada High School, which stood up where the fire department currently is. She was a member of Tau Kappa Kappa, which was a local sorority, and apparently the first successful Greek letter organization at Ohio Northern. And she was also a member of the Philomathian Literary Society. Now, the literary societies were vital to the existence of the university up to the 1920s because they were intimately involved with the curriculum. They provided students with places to give presentations, but they also, all 3 of them, maintained their own libraries. Next up was Anne, and she was a member of the Franklin Society. She had a very varied career and ended up the last few years of her life living with Francis. And these 2 literary societies had their headquarters on the top floor of what we now call Hill Building. And if this looks a little different than it does today, you'll see the reason why momentarily. But what we're really interested in is Frances. She was the baby of the family, certainly the most widely traveled and adventurous of the group, and she was the wife of Robert Heterick. She graduated again from Ada High School, and she was the class salutatorian. The newspaper coverage of her presentation indicated that it was really quite a presentation to hear. But in addition to oratory, while she was a student, she was on the women's baseball team. It's a little hard probably to see, but these ladies are playing in long dresses that go all the way down to their ankles. So talk about a handicap. I'm not exactly certain. Modesty might have allowed them to roll up their sleeves, but that would be about it. Nevertheless, there were 3 women in this early group that qualified for varsity letters. And the thing that's unusual about this was, first of all, that they were female students getting these letters, and this was years and years before the existence of the Men's Society. This was, or association, this was the ONU Athletic Association awarding them the letters. So you get the feeling that she was, of the 3 sisters, very nice people, I'm certain, but she was the one that was maybe had a little extra spark. She also was a member of Tau Kappa Kappa, and she rounded out the literary society situation by being a member of the Adelphian Society. Now, in addition to the Literary Society libraries, the university did have a small library and reading room on the first floor of the old Normal School building. The Normal School building was on the site of what is now Lur Memorial, and it was demolished in order to permit Lur to be built. In addition, of course, you had the society libraries, and you can see one here. The library consists of a series of large bookcases towards the rear of their meeting hall. All 3 of the Felker sisters would have been very familiar with this arrangement, and as well as its shortcomings. And one of the big problems, of course, was that the societies were chronically short of funds. They were always very happy to get contributions, oftentimes gifts in kind. And one situation, one example of that, was with the school's founder, Dr. Lur. You can see here we have a book plate for item number 775. And we have Dr. Lur's handy acquisitions list here. And if you look at 775, which is listed here, you find that it's Hancock's book, The Educator. So there are a few of these early works that we have in our collection, not, however, very many. Well, as I mentioned, this was not necessarily a sustainable situation, but at the time it worked well enough, and Frances graduated, entered nurses training at Good Samaritan Hospital in Cincinnati, where by a strange coincidence there was a resident, a Robert Heterick, and the following year they married. Now, I don't know whether this is still the same was the case at that time, but my guess is that probably they did not, the hospital staff did not approve of socializing between the nursing students and physicians. But as I say, I think that I got the feeling that Frances was maybe a little more adventuresome, and in any case, the 2 of them did marry. And 2 years later, or a year later, Robert entered the Army in their medical department, stationed first in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and then later in 1911, he had sort of a horizontal career move. He entered the Public Health Service, and this was a career choice which certainly allowed for a great deal of travel. As a matter of fact, his first posting afterwards was to Hong Kong. Now, because there were still relatives here in Ada, Frances and her husband would have been very well aware of what was happening in Ada at that time. We can see here the Normal School building in the center, and Hill building as it existed then as the administration building. Well, while they were off at the start of Robert's career, a decision was made by the literary societies to get out of the library business. They realized they didn't have the resources. So all of those collections were rolled together and put on the top floor, along with the reading room materials, the top floor of Hill Building. And I said you'd find out why it doesn't look quite this way today. And come November 1913, there was a fire. Now the interesting thing is, however, that about a third of the collection was saved. It was sort of a reverse of our 1968 book brigade arrangement, relay, and students were frantically throwing books out the windows, carrying them down the back stairs, and they did salvage some materials, such as the items that we have here. When Hill Building was when Luhr Memorial was constructed, the library was given the entire second floor of the building. And I imagine that the president is sort of drooling when he looks at all of that open space there. But at one point, this was simply one open facility. And that was the library's home up until 1930. Meanwhile, back with the Hetericks, they were going from place to place. I think there should probably be a cartoon bubble over Francis's head saying, "Oh, not another move." But nevertheless, as a military wife, that was, pretty much what she would have expected. And these postings really did vary. The Philippines, New York. Towards the end of maybe the latter half of his career, they seemed to center on the California area. And but nevertheless, the family did keep in touch through visits and correspondence with the local area. For instance, the Ada Herald had a very nice article back in 1943 acknowledging a gift of travel books, what else, to the public library. I don't know how many ONU students benefited from this, because 1943, 1944, there were only about 200 of them. But nevertheless, it does show a continued connection with the university and a concern for libraries. Well, at this time, of course, the library had moved out of Luhr Memorial and into Brown Hall. Now, if you're looking at this building and saying, "I don't recognize that," well, there's a very good reason. It was torn down in 1976, but it sat on the corner of South Main and University Avenue, right in front of Hill Building. And if you look at the picture of the interior, you can see it was originally set up as a combination auditorium and gymnasium, and you can see part of the running track is still in place there. That 1953 date, however, is really quite important. The end of the Second World War, Robert Heterick retired after a career of, well, some 38 years. He didn't totally retire. He's taught at various institutions, mostly in the western United States. And when they moved to Arizona, he was consultant for the state of Arizona, and then played a rather interesting role in their city of their adopted city, Albuquerque, in helping to squelch a bubonic plague outbreak. So really quite an active individual, and both of the Hetericks were interested in art and collected Chinese textiles. Now, I mentioned that 1953 date just a moment ago, and this was about the time that there was a great deal of pressure on the university to become accredited. And one of the things that the accrediting body was displeased with was the Brown Hall Library. it was a Depression-era expedient, but it had served its purpose. And so the decision was made to relocate the library to Presser Hall. And the reason that this is notable is because that was the year that the Pressers gave, or the Hetericks gave their first major contribution to the university. This was roughly $500,000, and very timely it was. The library was, of course, named after them the following year. The plaque that you see here is the same one that is in the entryway. It was one of a pair that was in a niche in front of Presser. You'll also notice that there's another niche there. There was another plaque there, but that's another story. Well, unfortunately, Robert died. His ashes were interred in the front lawn of Presser. Then subsequently, Frances passed on, and her ashes were placed in the front lawn as well, with an idea, because this was 1964, with the idea that they would be placed in a future library. Question: where does the future library go? After all, it's been every place on campus that's conceivable. Well, not quite, but just that, and we'll get to that in just a second. The library, of course, was located, most of the reading room was what is now the Snyder Recital Hall. It's a little different. The stage had the book stacks and offices, and the realization was that this was, at best, again, another stopgap measure. It served its purpose, but then the library moved on. 1953, the enrollment was right around 900 students. By 1963-64, it was well over 2,000. So this was something that was had to be made. Now, a lot of institutions, when they are faced with questions of expansion, really have to scratch their heads because they're landlocked. It's very difficult to find a place to expand. Not so Ohio Northern. We had, believe it or not, a College of Agriculture between 1912 and 1925. And the university very wisely held on to that land. There was a farmer, a Mr. Rockwell, who leased that land for many years, and it produced some income for the university. But when, in the 1950s and 1960s, the university began to grow, the administration only had to turn to the west, and there was the solution to the question. This picture was taken about 1950, and you can see that you've got a lot of empty space, but very conveniently located to start constructing the West Campus. And you can, whoops-a-daisy. And you can see, for instance, here is Lima Hall, and this is part of the Macintosh cafeteria. Well, ground was broken for the Heterick building in 1966, and construction went on at a pretty good clip. The decision was made when this building was constructed to build it so that it could take an additional 2 floors. And it's also, if you look around, you can see there are no internal load-bearing walls. It's tremendously flexible, and that was not done by accident. The people involved at that time said, we have been in every building on campus, in every configuration conceivable. This is going to be it. And so they, I would argue, did a building and did it right. The result was that by February 1968, there was a building. It was an empty building. It had furniture but no bodies. It had the start of book stacks but no shelves or books. It even had its namesakes in the northwest corner of the building. And they were probably wondering, where is our library? There's nobody here. Well, as you know, 50 years ago today, that question was answered. We had a group of students, faculty, administrators carrying approximately 70,000 volumes, the give or take 525 paces from Presser Hall to the library. And the building more or less came to life at that point. Now, I could end the presentation right now, but that really would not, I think, give you a sense of this building and its significance. The technology of the time in '68, for instance, meant that you had card catalogs and you used paper indexes to look up magazine articles. Today, you have computer terminals, and indeed, you don't even have to be in the building to access several million volumes, books that are owned by academic libraries across the state, or many, many millions of electronic journal articles. Likewise, when students have done their research, it used to be that they ended up having to type the paper. And this is probably a little difficult to see, but there's a little device in the corner of the desk here. That's a timer. You'd put coins in it and turn the handle, and it would tick, 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 tick away for 30 minutes or whatever, and then ding, you have to put more money in. But at least there were electric typewriters. There was a little bit of an improvement. We got some electronic word processing typewriters. These had a word processing program preloaded, so you were kind of limited to what you could do, but you could print things out. And then in 1985, the clouds parted and technology rained down. We got our very first computer cluster on campus with machines that were the equivalent of an IBM PC with a 20 megabyte hard drive and color monitors. So it didn't get any better than that at the time. Well, there were a fair number of changes over the years. The collection continued to grow. The student body certainly did. And new services were added. A lot of the same pressures that led the university to construct the basic building in the first place. And something had to be done. By 1999, it was pretty obvious that it was time to reach into that bag of tricks and pull out a third floor. And so there was a groundbreaking. We have the usual suspects lined up here. And over a remarkably short period of time, the contractors hauled in structural steel, concrete panels, and we ended with a third floor on the building. And so there we are. But wait, there's still more. Because even though we had a third floor on the building, needs continued to change. And as a result, this first floor was completely revamped back in 2016, 2017. And this is where the question or the feature of flexibility for the building comes in, because it was, I wouldn't say easy, it took a lot of thought, but it was possible to update this first floor and make it far more relevant to today's needs. And that included, of course, a food bar, lots of open and flexible seating, an improved circulation desk, lots of collaborative study areas, and of course a revised computer lab. So the work goes on. Back in 1968, students found that their biggest problem was finding information. The paper indexes and card catalogs were time-consuming to use, and once you found a citation, often as not, we'd still have to get materials from another library. Today, it's the exact reverse. Back in 1968, our faculty, or our librarians were available to help students of that generation find their information or satisfy their information needs. Today, the metaphor is like drinking from a fire hose, trying to deal with this overflow of information. One thing hasn't changed. We still have very excellent staff here to help our students and faculty. We now are 50 years on. I'd like to think that the Hetericks are here with us, at least in spirit. I know that Oscar and Judy Mifsud are here very much in person, and I'd like to thank both of you and sort of posthumously our two original donors for your support. Thank you.